everybody, welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Thursday, the 17th. In last class, I had reviewed the syllabus and I had optimistically assigned a couple of chapters for you to read today, though I am well aware that you may still be adding or dropping or getting textbooks. So these first few chapters that I've assigned are basically introduction to the class itself. So I wanted to cover some of the major points of those chapters, and certainly if you haven't had a chance to read them, you can go back after the fact and review them. And if you will remember, I had skipped the section of the syllabus entitled plagiarism. So I wanted to talk about that today before I actually start talking about the textbook. And plagiarism is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So what you need to do is to give credit. And I used to give a couple of examples of how and why you should avoid plagiarism. And one actually occurred to me early on in my career, and this was pre-internet, where I am reading a paper and I realize something sounds familiar. And after a few minutes, it occurred to me that it was familiar because it was from our assigned college textbook. With a few mechanical mistakes here and there, I don't know if that was done deliberately to deceive me or if that was just an example of a sloppy plagiarist. The better story did not occur to me, but occurred around the same time, pre-internet. It was in all the academic newspapers, and it occurred to a middle-aged professor. That part's important. And he's reading papers and he realizes that something sounds familiar. And after thinking about it for a few minutes, he comes to the realization that it wasn't something that he had read, it was something that he himself had written. It was one of his papers when he was an undergraduate decades earlier. And I don't remember all the details. It has something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers. Of course, we live in a brave new world right now of artificial intelligence. And I encourage you not to use artificial intelligence, at least for this particular class. I think you can rely on your natural intelligence. And I have deliberately constructed the class in such a way that you are rewarded for effort as well as for product. And that's not to say that artificial intelligence doesn't have its place. And in fact, we're going to be talking about it in much more depth as the semester progresses. But I've got multiple reasons as to why I encourage you to avoid it. The first is that it's not always accurate. So if you've been keeping track of the news, then you can see that this is something that has been illustrated with the artificial intelligence platform of Grok, where it has been basically spewing misinformation and also biased information. And there's a link for this below under the plagiarism section in the notes that I have below in case you wanted to read more about this. The idea of the ethics of artificial intelligence using the products of human beings and not in any way compensating or acknowledging them, I think is somewhat problematic. The um, science fiction aficionado will probably tell you that things don't go well when we release control to computers. I also think about some of the significant economic consequences that can occur. Changes that we've seen in the past that should occur over decades are literally occurring over days now with the speed of artificial intelligence. So those are all of my reasons. So if you'll remember that for the class, you're being asked to do informal writing assignments. These are journal writing assignments with your reflections about media, something that influences all of us. You're also asked to write attendance questions or respond to attendance questions that count as basically your attendance for that particular class. You do have a final exam. That's an essay exam, but it will be open book, open note. This is not a class about memorization. It's a class about understanding, being able to synthesize all the topics that we're talking about. And a final project for you to examine something about media in a little bit more depth, something of interest to you, which leads us to actually the readings that I had assigned. Chapter 1, Media, Culture, and Communication, a critical approach. How do you examine media from an academic standpoint? When most media is not produced to be examined carefully, it's meant for entertainment or it's meant for profit. Not that there's anything wrong with entertainment or profit. And then chapter 14, why and how to do media research. And just talking a little bit about how this is developed as an academic discipline. So I wanted to start with some definitions. The first is communication, because this is ultimately what media does. It's ways to convey information in meeting. And you've got a sender, you've got a receiver, sometimes you've got a gatekeeper that's mediating the message. Media, when we use that term, it's just a channel of communication. It could be a book or newspaper, a magazine, a radio, movie, TV, music, gaming, internet. In fact, we'll talk about all of these as separate entities as the semester progresses. Mass media is meant for large numbers of people. So large numbers of people are consuming this media. Affordances, and you might have noticed that the textbook will oftentimes bold these terms to make things a little bit easier for you. As an introductory course, a 100 coded course, a lot of the courses in that vein oftentimes have to introduce language associated with the particular discipline. Affordances, what features of the media determine its usage, how we use it, when we use it, why we use it. And the media environment, which is something that we are all in. It's the surrounding media habitat. Media is everywhere. And it's populated with media citizens. Whether we like it or not, we are surrounded by media and we utilize media. So, social media, it's a very specialized kind of media. Online modes of communication for communal reasons. And of course, we are in the midst of that revolution, as well as media convergence, the merging of what was once different channels of media. They all used to be separate entities, books, newspapers, magazines, and so forth and so on. And now all of them can be accessed through the internet. So now it's a question of, can we see those as separate entities when the mode of receipt is oftentimes through an internet service? Popular, because after all, this is a media and popular culture class. It's supported by many, the masses. That's oftentimes seen as somehow lesser than, a little bit more lowbrow. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but that's the way it has been seen in the past. As I've told you, I've got lots of eclectic interests. So in addition to teaching Shakespeare, I can teach media and popular culture, or the influence of horror film in popular culture, which is another class that I teach, which is also a CMN class. So, culture. And we could spend an entire semester trying to define this word. I suppose that in the broadest sense of the word, it's any group measurement, or any group membership, I should say, that has some predictive qualities. So, for behaviors, which are actions, those are usually fairly easy to gauge. Attitudes, emotional responses, those may or may not be easy to gauge. Beliefs, things that individuals and the group think are true or false. And values, which I think encompasses all of those behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs, and they can be firmly embedded and highly resistant to change. Another way that we've talked about culture is the arts, and that's usually viewed as high culture because it doesn't necessarily appeal to large groups of people. Usually it's directed to a smaller group with political and educational backgrounds. That said, cultural studies has become more and more important in our society. It's interdisciplinary, it's interpretive, it is applying many of the research methods from the hard and soft sciences to something that is much more subjective, because again, culture, when we talk about it as group membership, we usually think about these very large cultures based on things like ethnicity or gender or age, but it can be very specialized based on a hobby, an interest, or a shared experience. For better or worse, this class is a culture. It will develop behaviors and attitudes and beliefs and perhaps even values. So, thinking about the cultural context, how does the context of the times influence the production of the media? Now, the textbook gives you an example from 2018, the film Black Panther, which I still have to see. I've heard wonderful things about. But a film that I examined in my horror film class, which I highly recommend that you see, is Get Out, 2017. And I suspect from what I've read about Black Panther, it shares some similarities with Get Out in that it really is a commentary about the Obama era, our first black president, and some of the fallout resulting from that. That said, Get Out, I would say, is a very literary text, lots of symbolism. And again, I haven't seen Black Panther. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. But both of these texts, while created for entertainment and created for profit, also are trying to do something more, trying to give some sort of a message. And sometimes media texts give messages that are deliberate and conscious. Jordan Peele, the director of Get Out, said that that was his intention. Sometimes they are more subconscious because we are all products of our culture and we all have biases and assumptions. And oftentimes you can tell a great deal about a culture by looking at its media and what it values or what it doesn't value. Now, politics, we usually talk about that in terms of political parties, but in a broader way of thinking about politics, particularly with cultural studies, is how power, resources, status, and visibility are distributed in a culture. And almost always there's unequal distribution. And then the hows and the whys are when you start getting into political party perspectives. A book that I usually quote in this context, actually a horror book, is by Richard Matheson, I Am Legend. You might have seen the film with Will Smith, but that's not necessarily accurate to the text. Not at all unusual that a film will take liberties, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. It's a very influential horror text. But one line has always struck me with that normalcy is a majority concept. Normalcy is a majority concept. And it's true that usually the majority, the larger group of individuals, are the individuals with most power. So the 1% might not necessarily be the largest in groups of numerical membership, but it certainly has the most power. They usually determine the agenda. And we're talking about how this agenda is discussed or not discussed in the public sphere, which should be a place for critical debate, which is what we're doing in this particular class. So popular culture are the beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values of large masses of people. Again, it's oftentimes seen as a lower culture or a less than because it appeals to larger groups. Now, that said, we can divide up our periods into the pre-1950s and the 1950s forward. You might have heard of the term postmodern era, which is what we are characterized as, 1950s to now. Prior to the postmodern era, there was the modern era. And both terms are somewhat unfortunate because what are you going to do after the postmodern era? Say postmodern era. But nevertheless, the modern era, this was pre-1950s. This is where we see the rise of mass communication. And we will talk about some of the history of mass communication channels. And this was a focus on experts and expertise. The postmodern era from the 1950s on is defined by something called populism, where you are appealing to ordinary people rather than appealing to experts. And what we see is a good amount of diversity and fragmentation. And we also see sometimes nostalgia, a sentimental yearning for the past, as well as paradox, which seem to be seeming contradictions. Now, all of this is exhibited in media, which basically give narratives. These are stories and messages about behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values. And of course, we can also examine the ethics, the moral principles associated with it. The field of study, media literacy, it's basically about understanding how mass media influences us and influences other people. And if you look at the section below, in the notes below, in section 11, under media literacy, you'll see that there is a process that the text talks about, that if you're going to examine a piece of media, usually you describe it, you document information about it. Then you analyze it, you try to determine patterns. And then you interpret it, you offer possible meanings of those patterns. You evaluate it, you give some sort of an informed judgment. And then, if any engagement is necessary, some sort of active involvement, some sort of attempt for change or for political or social movement, that's when it would happen after all of these pieces. Now, the history of media begins with the oral tradition. So, if you know anything about literature, literature began in the oral tradition with the great epic poets, like the Iliad, great epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And that ultimately transitioned into a manuscript culture where very few people had access to literacy, and they would produce laboriously by hand texts that could be read. So now they've got a level of permanence that you wouldn't have in the oral tradition. Of course, everything changed with the printing press. This is where you see the spread of literacy as texts became much more accessible, just because there were more of them, and they were also much less expensive and much less laborious to produce. Some of the consequences of literacy, resistance to authority, that you don't necessarily have to rely on a translator, let's say something like the church, to translate a text for you, because you could read the text yourself, such as the Bible, and translate it on your own. And individualism. As more and more people began to read, more and more people began to see different viewpoints and began questioning the world around them. I also teach a women in literature class. One of the things we talk about is an essay entitled The Cult of True Womanhood, which talks about magazines actually from the 1800s and about how those magazines illustrated some of the fears of society, of how women could become more literate and more educated and more powerful through reading, particularly literature. So literature was seen as a political vehicle, as well as a social vehicle or a vehicle for economic advantage. And if you've ever read something like Emily Dickinson or something like Jane Eyre, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, after the printing press, we moved into the electronic era, which allowed us to spread information in real time. It separated messages from transportation, something like having to transport a book to a particular locale so that you would go to that locale or get that book or read that book. It basically has created, which is where we are now, a mass nation, or where we were, I should say, a mass nation of consensus narratives. So initially in the electronic era, this would have been during my youth, actually. There were very few media options. I do remember where there were three major television channels: ABC, NBC, CBS. We didn't have streaming, we didn't have internet. So basically, we were all consuming much of the same media at the same time, and this led to a sense of community. But it also didn't necessarily lead to any kind of narrative that was complex, at least in the way that we think of individualized narratives today, because it was trying to appeal to the masses. We used to call this the water cooler moment, where we would talk about, around the water cooler at work, for instance, the television show that we all watched, or seemingly all watched, the night beforehand, all at the same time, of course, because we couldn't stream. And Where we are now, mass personal communication, we're not just consuming media, we're creating it. I'm creating media right now. So we are creators and consumers. That has certainly complicated things. The smartphone changed everything because now media became mobile. And of course, as we know, artificial intelligence is changing everything as I speak. So, those are some of the major pieces of the first chapter that I assigned that I wanted you to think about. And I also assigned chapter 15, media effects and research. Now, this is a very complex topic that's been basically summarized in a chapter. So do understand that this is an oversimplification. But it gives you an idea of how media studies have worked to become academic disciplines. So I remember I used to teach a class on analyzing commercials. And again, commercials were never meant to be analyzed from an academic perspective, but you could learn so much about the values of a culture. And I'll never forget that a student had written a paper about a print ad that actually I had seen in magazines previously. I'm sure lots of people had. It was advertising an alcoholic beverage, and it was during the holidays, and it was basically an image of a glass with the beverage and ice. The student had argued that sex was being used to sell this product. Not at all an unusual argument because sex is usually used to sell many products. But by glancing at the ad, you wouldn't immediately make a connection until the student pointed out that if you looked carefully in the ice cubes, you would see the image of a naked woman. And I was at first skeptical because this was an ad that I had seen, glanced at, granted, multiple times, and had never seen an image of a naked woman. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I directed my attention to the ad that was included with the paper, and lo and behold, there was an image of a naked woman there, working on a subconscious level, I'm sure, in terms of the alcoholic beverage. So you don't have to be necessarily schooled in media studies to know that sex is an important element in our culture, and certainly our media and our advertising reflects that. So, media affects research, trying to apply scientific inquiry, objective principles to examining something that is subjective, which can be media. What are the effects of mass media? And we think of mass media as text. So, even though we usually talk about a text as a book, a movie or a television show or a website could be considered a text or a social media entry or post. And how do these texts influence individuals and society, groups of people, cultures? And what you try to do, perhaps, is to conduct some experiments where you isolate one aspect to study and then you examine its effect. Lots of different kinds of research that can be applied. Foundational research tries to get a broad, shared, objective understanding about an issue. Applied research oftentimes will be directed towards specific real world scenarios. Critical research, where you oftentimes talk about the moral or the ethical consequences. And the text also talks about, our textbook talks about the scientific method. So this might sound familiar to you from your science classes, where you can apply the scientific method to something like media studies, where you identify a problem, you review any existing research, you develop a working hypothesis, you determine an appropriate measurement method. Maybe it's a survey, maybe it's a lab, maybe it's a real world scenario. You collect data, you analyze the results, you form a conclusion, and you try to be objective, eliminate bias, but of course, there's always bias. You try to be reliable. Can it be sufficiently repeated? And you try to be valid, that you are measuring what you claim to be measuring. And of course, as you know, that all scientific experiments have their strengths and weaknesses. And always it is good to remember that things are much more complex than just a series of steps that one needs to take. And while the textbook talks about different ways of going about conducting research, I would really think about them as blending into one, that you use the media that you're studying to determine how to study it, rather than the other way around, taking a particular approach and using that approach to study all media, especially in the early stages of you studying media, which is where we are. But to give you an idea, this turned into a kind of academic discipline in the 1920s. So we've been doing this from an academic standpoint for about 100 years or so. There was and is something called propaganda analysis, where you measure and interpret the deliberate spreading of messages to influence and control others. Oftentimes, this is in relation to politics and government. There is public opinion research, where you measure and interpret data taken from respondents, surveys, for instance. There's social psychological research. So, for those of you who are taking psychology or sociology, you measure and interpret behavior and the thoughts of individuals. There's marketing research, where you measure and interpret consumer buying habits. There's content analysis research, where you measure and interpret media textual images. And again, I would mix and match all of these, but there is a very interdisciplinary sense to media studies, as well as the possible effects of media. There is one model that's called the hypodermic needle model, that basically media influences users, which is true, but up to a point. There's the minimal effects model, that media is selectively chosen by users. So this is selective exposure. So we pick and choose which media that we consume, and that's going to reflect our values. That's also true up until a point. The uses and gratification model, that media satisfies our emotional or our intellectual needs. And that's also true up to a point. The social learning theory, that media influences behavior, which is true up to a point. The agenda setting theory, that media determines what is important by what it discusses and what it leaves out. That's also true up to a point. Cultivation effect theory, that media influences our perceptions, which is true, but again, up to a point. Political economy studies, that media is intertwined with economics and politics, which is also true up to a point. The third person effect, that the belief that others are more influenced by media than oneself, which I think is usually true, though up to a point. And the spiral of silence effect, fascinating, that minority opinions aren't oftentimes shared with others because of fear of ridicule or of some sort of negative consequence. In other words, media is complex. So keep that in mind as we are studying all this media, and that all of these influences and effects can be applicable at the same time. And there's lots of different methods that you can utilize to study the media. Some general questions for you just to keep in the back of your mind as the semester progresses. How has media evolved and why? And as I indicated, part of this class is talking about the history of the media we will be examining. How does media construct meaning and why? What is included and excluded in media and why? How should media communicate and why? And lastly, what role does media play in democracy and why? I think those are general questions that you can apply to all media. I had a more specific question for you to contemplate on. It's a question that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer, which I think is oftentimes the case in media studies. And specifically, it's about something that the textbook I don't think talked very much about, which I find surprising. There are new editions of the book that are put out fairly regularly, and it makes a certain amount of sense that this happened with media studies. I'm not so sure that this makes sense with some other disciplines where new editions seem very similar to the previous editions with minor changes to justify the cost of a new textbook. But media is moving so quickly. The reality is that by the time a book is printed, it's probably out of date. And probably what we talk about at the beginning of class will be out of date by the ending of class. Just because, again, the speed at which media is developing, which I find fascinating because a lot of this is going to be based on our own personal experiences with media. The attendance question for our class discussion forum then is about something that we all experience collectively, and I think we all have similarities and differences in how we experienced it. But hopefully this is a once in a century experience, something like a mass pandemic. And specifically for us, it was COVID-19. How do you think COVID-19 influenced mass media and why? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer about this. I'm really curious about your own reflections and your own experiences. Though certainly feel free to ask other individuals and gather data or at least information if you so please. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your peers. Think of it as raising your hand in class, for instance. But you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn, and that'll give you a good idea of what we would have talked about in class. So again, and you don't need to start a new thread with this. You can just click on the discussion forum post or go directly to the discussion forum. How do you think COVID-19 influenced and perhaps still influences mass media, and why? You'll remember our last attendance question, which is going to be due today, is because you have 48 hours, and technically our class began on Tuesday, even though the semester began on Monday. Our last attendance question was an introduction. So I thought I'd share with you my introduction, and I, of course, will be reading all of your introductions and responding over the next several days. But as for me, I was born and raised in New York City, and I attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester, where I remember very clearly the marketing materials indicated that students would experience, quote, real winters there, unquote. And oh boy, did I. I found out that meant almost continual snowfall. But nevertheless, I stayed, where I majored in English, minored in psychology, and I was absolutely positively certain I was going to become an attorney and go to law school, which goes to show how your career goals and interests can change when you're in college. What ended up happening is I fell in love with literature, and I decided that instead of law school, I wanted to go to graduate school, though in a warm climate. So I found a graduate school in Southern California, UCLA, where I studied Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And while indeed we didn't have snowfall, we had other weather challenges, things like earthquakes and droughts and so forth. But I stayed, finished my education, began teaching, and realized I was missing winter after all. So I began to apply to positions on the East Coast. One was in a small town I'd never heard of, a place called Greenfield. So you know how this story will end. And I applied and I was asked out for an interview. And we talked a bit about what my transition might be like after living in Southern California for several years, coming to New England. But I was assured that the winters here are, quote, not that bad, unquote. And after all, I did have experience with winter. New York City has a little bit of a winter, and certainly Rochester, New York does. Well, I started in the 1993-94 academic year, which was a historical year because we broke most of the records that existed for cold and ice and snowfall. In other words, it was a brutal winter. No one was prepared for it. Certainly I wasn't prepared for it. But I remained, and I've been here ever since, teaching initially English classes, but then I've branched out to things like public speaking and media classes as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on with the readings next class, as well as talk about some upcoming assignments. Take care. Bye-bye.